There was something about that hand that didn't belong in that room. A thick, calloused hand with grease stains deeply embedded in the creases of the fingers. Holding a small and improbable object, the transparent barrel of a BIC pen adapted with surgical precision to a saline for drip. Inside this crude, ingenious device, an intensely cobalt blue liquid pulsed as if it had a life of its own, shimmering under the cold light of the room. Somewhere nearby, a heart monitor sang its bleakest warning. The rhythm that should have beaten strong and steady was drifting away from regularity, approaching, beat by beat, the definitive silence. And there was a breath gasping, wet, desperate from someone whose lungs were forgetting how to perform the task of existing. The voice arrived before any explanation, deep, flat, unhurried, like someone reading a grocery list. The antidote for the synthetic neurotoxin, Conus imperialis, only exists in a liquid state for 4 to 7 seconds. After that, it crystallizes and becomes inert. You have 12 seconds to sign. The man's face told a story that words could never capture. Purple, swollen, his eyes wide with the kind of sheer terror that only appears when the entire body understands, all at once, that it might stop working at any moment. Drool slid slowly down his chin, staining the Italian silk tie, trailing down the lapel of an Armani suit that probably cost more than most people make in 6 months. His hands shook so violently it seemed impossible for him to hold anything. But a solid gold Montblanc pen was placed between those convulsing fingers. And the choice laid out before him couldn't be simpler. Either he signed or he died right there. But to understand how a man like this arrived at this exact moment, we need to go back. We need to go back to where it all started. We need to meet the people he destroyed before someone, finally, decided to do something about it. The Aurelia Medical Complex wasn't a hospital. It was a statement of power disguised as architecture. Anyone who walked through those tempered glass automatic doors instantly felt the divide between that place and the rest of the world. The white and gold terracotta marble floors reflected the light of Swarovski crystal. Chandeliers hanging from the ceiling like artificial constellations, each one worth more than a decent sedan. The AC system pumped out a carefully curated scent-fresh bergamot with oud wood. The exact blend sensory experience consultants charged a fortune to recommend to high-end clinics. There was no smell of antiseptic here. No squeaking of gurneys on linoleum floors, no static from a ceiling-mounted TV playing a daytime soap opera. What they had was elegant silence, background piano music, and the muted click of leather shoes on marble. It was the kind of place that only cured those who could afford to be cured. She walked into this setting like someone walking into a ballroom wearing the wrong uniform. Sarah Miller's white scrubs were the right color for the environment. But everything else gave away that she was from another world. Her 6-month pregnant belly pressed softly against the fabric near her waistband, creating that gentle, unmistakable curve that made no apologies for existing, but also hadn't been planned for her work schedule. Her orthopedic shoes white, scuffed on the sides. The soles worn down asymmetrically because she always shifted her weight to her left foot after standing for too many hours told the story of someone who spent far more time walking than sitting down. Her dark circles were deep. Not the kind that show up after a bad night's sleep. They were the permanent bruises of someone living in continuous survival mode. 2 jobs. One in that marble and crystal complex, carrying trays for patients who never learned how to say thank you. The other at a public across town, where the hallways reeked of rubbing alcohol and the floors were made of faded green rubber. Said morning. Her hands held a tray with the 2 items that made up the preferred breakfast of the patient in room 1401, a cup of Kopi Luwak, the most expensive coffee in the world, brewed from beans that pass through the digestive tract of an Asian palm civet and are then sold at absurd prices to people who confuse exclusivity with quality, and an edible 24-karat gold leaf croissant, delivered every morning by a specialty pastry chef in a refrigerated box. Sarah's hands were shaking slightly, not from nerves, from hunger. She had skipped breakfast because she was running late for her shift after pulling an all-nighter at the public, the baby inside her. whom she had decided to name Michael before even knowing the gender. Shifted every now and then with the impatience of someone who doesn't understand why the food is taking so long. She didn't see him coming. Few people in the hallway ever actually saw Richard Sterling III coming. They just saw the ripple effects of his arrival. The space around him rearranged itself. Secretaries straightened their posture. Doctors checked their phones unnecessarily just to have something to look at. Security guards subtly stepped out of his path. He always walked in talking, always. The phone glued to his ear was almost an extension of his face, and his voice loud, sharp, carrying that particular arrogance of someone who had never in his life heard a no that actually mattered filled the entire corridor before his body even arrived. I don't care what the broker said. I want that yacht docked in Miami by Thursday, or the contract goes to our competitor and your commission goes right out the window with it. Make it happen, he gestured as he spoke. It was the habit of a man raised to believe the air around his body was his own private real estate. His arm swung out to emphasize a point in the negotiation. The tray didn't stand a chance. The impact was blunt and violent. The porcelain cup flew off the tray in an arc, flipped once in midair as if in slow motion, and shattered against the marble floor with a sound that echoed down the entire hallway, a sharp, definitive crack, like a pistol shot in a closed room. The Kopi Luwak coffee spread into a dark, perfect stain over the navy blue lapel of Richard Sterling's custom-tailored suit. The silence that followed lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then he looked at the stain. Then he looked at Sarah. Then he looked at her belly, and something in his eyes shifted. Not for the worse. He was already at his worst. It was as if the sight of that pregnant belly had flipped some private switch inside him. That dark corner of a man's character that only reveals itself when he knows there will be absolutely no consequences. Do you have any idea how much this costs? Sarah opened her mouth. The words came out in a stutter, the way they always do when the body is trying to process pure shock and overwhelming guilt at the exact same time. Sir, I'm so sorry. I didn't see you, but he wasn't interested in apologies. He was interested in something else entirely. He started moving. Slowly, with the deliberate pace of someone who knows their prey isn't going to fight back. He pulled a silk handkerchief from his pocket made by the same tailor who crafted the suits, naturally, and began dabbing the stain with slow, careless motions, stepping forward until Sarah's back hit the corridor wall and there was nowhere left to retreat. You reek of yesterday's deep fryer, he said it quietly, almost like a secret. As if he were sharing a critique on taste, not delivering an act of cruelty. That is the perfume of the poor. Sarah didn't answer. Her eyes welled with tears, but she still gripped the empty tray in front of her chest like a shield. You know what? He continued, his eyes raking up and down her body with a disgust that needed no added words, but he chose to use them anyway. Your brother. That one who looks like a fish out of water sweeping my parking lot. Maybe he'll inherit the gift of speech if I order your salary cut today. It'll be a great incentive for him to learn how to stutr properly. He spelled it out deliberately, smiling. It's hard to believe someone can be that cruel, isn't it? If you're just as outraged by this injustice, hit that like button right now to show you're on Sarah's side. Through the wide glass of the corridor, the parking lot below was visible to anyone who bothered to look. And there was a man down there wearing a grey janitorial uniform, gripping a long-handled broom against the black asphalt. He wasn't just sweeping. The dead leaves that had fallen overnight were being organized into patterns. Not randomly into complex mathematical patterns, Fibonacci spirals drawn on the parking lot pavement with the same meticulous care an artist pours into a fresco. Matthew's lips moved silently as he worked, reciting something only he could hear, maybe numbers, maybe sequences. Maybe the kind of order the world rarely offered and that he had to create on his own. He didn't look at the people walking by. He never did. People were noise, unpredictable variables that messed up the patterns. But there were things he heard even when he didn't want to listen. The muffled echo of held-back tears coming from the floor above reached him through the glass. It wasn't just any crying, it was his sister's specific cry. He had known that sound since childhood. Since the nights their mother was sick and Sarah would cry softly in her room so she wouldn't wake anyone up, Matthew stopped. The broom went perfectly still. His fingers tightened around the handle with a slow, escalating pressure until his knuckles turned as white as the marble inside. His eyes drifted up slowly toward the corridor window. There was no anger in them. Anger was an emotion Matthew processed differently than most people. He converted it into something else first, into data, into variables, into problems that required solving. What was in his eyes, for anyone who knew how to read them, was something much colder and vastly more patient than rage. It was the expression of an equation that had just found all of its missing variables. The new suit was navy blue too, but a different shade from the last, darker. Almost the color of the ocean right before a hurricane. Richard Sterling had sent a driver to fetch it from his office while the stained one was rushed to a specialty dry cleaner. The very idea of wearing a stained suit, even for a few hours, was unthinkable for a man like him. The 12th floor conference room was made entirely of glass. Not by accident, everything in that complex was calculated. The glass let the outside world see exactly who was inside, and allowed the people inside to feel like the outside world was nothing but background scenery. 12 doctors filled the chairs around the imported solid oak table. They weren't ordinary doctors. These were the names headlining international symposiums, the ones publishing articles in the journals other doctors read just to feel inadequate. Their scrubs were custom-tailored from Italian fabric with the hospital's logo embroidered in silk thread, a single detail that cost more than the monthly salary of any worker in the janitorial wing. Richard stood at the head of the table. No slides, no presentation. He didn't need visual aids. He was the visual aid. The quarter closed 42% above projections. He dropped the words like a winning hand on a poker table, waiting for their faces to react. They reacted. That means expansion into London and Geneva by the end of the year. It means every single one of you will see double the high net worth patients moving through this facility. He paused. He paced slowly along the glass, looking down at the parking lot for a moment, the same parking lot where Matthew continued his geometric patterns with leaves and silence. Oh, and regarding this morning's little incident, his tone shifted. It became lighter, more casual, the kind of breezy preamble that comes before a joke only the teller finds funny. I had to have my lapel sanitized. One of the knocked-up nurses spilled my coffee. These parasites really ought to have a separate service entrance, just like the patients who roll in on public ambulances. By the way, a few polite chuckles rippled through the room. The kind of laughs people give when they're orbiting a powerful man and aren't quite sure if the joke is over yet. Others just stared down at their notes. No one said a word, because no one at that table had reached their position by saying the wrong things to the right people. Lunch had been catered by a Japanese-Peruvian fusion restaurant that operated exclusively for corporate events and required a 3-week advance reservation. The waiter, a young man in a black uniform and white gloves, entered the room carrying a low tray and arranged the appetizers with the flawless precision of someone trained for exactly this: halibut tiradito over Maya lemon foam, Wagyu carpaccio with freshly grated black truffles and dead center specifically for Richard, a one-of-a-kind salad, exotic microgreens, edible petals, and a dressing that shimmered with that highly specific emerald green hue that only certain deep-sea Pacific algae produce when cold-pressed. It was one of the house specialties. Served only upon prior request, Richard had ordered it a week in advance. He picked up his fork without breaking the conversation he had resumed with the cardiologist to his right about a real estate acquisition in Aspen. The first bite went into his mouth with the blind confidence of a man who had never in his life had a single reason to suspect what was on his plate. He chewed. He smiled. He muttered something about the dressing being exactly what he expected, and then his eyes snapped wide open. It wasn't an expression of pain. The pain would come later, and when it did, it would be a kind of agony he lacked the vocabulary to describe because he had never experienced anything remotely like it. What flashed in his eyes first was surprise, the genuine, almost childlike shock of someone who, for the very first time in his life, encounters a problem his own body cannot bully into submission. The fingers of his right hand, still gripping the fork, stopped taking orders from his brain. The fork dropped. The clatter of metal against the wooden table sliced through the conversation more efficiently than any word ever could. What happened over the next 8 minutes was the most expensive and utterly useless spectacle money could buy. The medical staff at the Aurelia was undeniably extraordinary. Their diagnostic imaging equipment was the most advanced available in the country. They had a 7 Tesla MRI machine imported directly from a German manufacturer that typically only sold to elite research universities. They had multi-parameter monitors tracking 53 physiological variables simultaneously, displaying them on glowing screens driven by early warning algorithms developed in partnership with a Swiss hospital. None of them had any idea what they were looking at. Richard's oxygen saturation plummeted to 70% while he was still being wheeled from the conference room to the ICU. Doctors swarmed the gurney, every single one of them brilliant. Every single one trained for the emergencies this kind of facility usually handled: heart attacks in high-stress executives, strokes in wealthy seniors, hypertensive crises in men who ate too much red meat and slept too little. But what was unfolding inside Richard Sterling's body wasn't listed in any medical protocol those people had ever studied. The toxin was a synthetic variant of Colintokin G, the venom produced by the Pacific cone snail, a creature nature had weaponized with one of the most lethal neurotoxins ever catalogued. But the version tearing through Richard's bloodstream hadn't come from a snail, it had come from a lab. One of 3 labs in the entire world with the technical capability to stabilize and synthesize that specific molecule. 2 of them belonged to covert government defense programs that would never acknowledge their existence. The third was a question no one in that room was equipped to answer. The CT scans showed flawless images of a brain with no apparent lesions. Blood tests came back completely normal because the available panels didn't scan the specific molecular window where this toxin operated. It was like trying to isolate a single, high-pitched note in a symphony using a microphone that only picked up bass. Richard's body began to arch on the stretcher. Not the subtle arch of a standard muscle spasm, it was the rigid, terrifying bow of an entire skeletal structure receiving hijacked signals. His muscles getting conflicting commands and firing all at once at maximum force. The smug arrogance that had defined his face for decades evaporated entirely. What replaced it was something Richard Sterling III had never revealed in any boardroom, in any ruthless negotiation, in any strategically calculated moment of vulnerability. It was raw, animal terror. The kind that bypasses the prefrontal cortex and couldn't care less about public image. The kind that has lived deep in the human nervous system for 200,000 years and does not distinguish between a Fortune 500 CEO and a guy picking through the trash. In the ICU hallway, Sarah was leaning against the wall, one hand resting protectively on her belly, her eyes tracking the chaotic blur moving around her. The doctors blew past her as if she were part of the drywall. A resident clipped her shoulder hard as he ran by, didn't slow down, didn't look back. The tray she had been carrying earlier had already been snatched up by someone, and her hands were completely empty now. She had no assigned task, nowhere she was specifically supposed to be, just that corridor. And that man on the gurney at the end of the hall, surrounded by people who made more in a week than she would in 2 years. She felt like she should be experiencing something simpler. She should feel relief or vindication, or at least the cold detachment of someone watching a villain finally cash out his karma. But what she felt was far messier and far more honest than she wanted to admit. There was a part of her, small, but undeniably there, that saw a human being dying and couldn't just stand by and watch. And then there was the other part, the part that remembered exactly how he had spelled that word out. Letter by letter, smiling. The voice came from right behind her with zero warning, no audible footsteps, as if it had just spawned into existence. His acetylcholine is being blocked at the nicotinic receptors. The ionic equation in the IV drip they're pushing is wrong. They're going to kill him in exactly 6 minutes and 14 seconds. Sarah turned around slowly. Matthew was standing there. The grey janitorial uniform. Hands resting flat at his sides, never in his pockets. Always hovering, his fingers slightly splayed, as if they needed room to compute. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the floor, but not in the way someone avoids eye contact out of fear or shyness. It was the gaze of a man staring at the floor, because right now, the floor was the whiteboard where the algorithms were running. How do you? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. I read about it, he said. Flat. No dramatic flair. No manufactured urgency, just the direct download of a data file that had been stored and was now being accessed. In the trash. In the medical journal the chief of surgery threw away because the math was too hard. Sarah looked at her brother, then back at the ICU, then at her brother again. The antidote isn't available commercially, Matthew continued, his lips moving with that same silent rhythm from when he arranged leaves in the lot. It's math. Now I'm asking you, if you were in Sarah's shoes, after everything that man said, after the way he spelled out every syllable just to humiliate her in front of everyone, would you have let your brother help? Or would you have stood back and let the equation balance itself out? Drop your opinion in the comments. I want to know what you would do. This story teaches us that the brilliance mocked by the pride of the powerful might be the exact thing that saves their lives, and that true compassion doesn't care who deserves it. If you love stories that touch the heart and make you think, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to join our family. The ICU hallway held that heavy, specific silence of a place where people are too terrified to make a sound. Sarah led the way. Matthew trailed one step behind, eyes locked on the floor, lips moving. She could hear him whispering numbers, not frantic, not rushed, just his usual steady cadence. As if the panic of the outside world operated on a frequency he couldn't even pick up. She had known that murmuring since they were kids. It was the sound he made when he was working. It was the most comforting and most terrifying sound in the world to her, depending entirely on the context. The context right now was a man dying on a table on the other side of a set of double doors. Roger Bates had been the head of security at the Aurelia for 11 years. He was the kind of guy who had built his entire personality around being an attack dog for a more powerful man, confusing that blind loyalty with actual authority. He was tall, built like a brick wall, with the thick neck of a guy who lifted weights out of habit rather than health. And he wore that specific sneer people develop when they spend too long believing a badge equates to moral superiority. He spotted them coming from 50 feet away. He stepped dead center into the hallway with the casual arrogance of a man who did this 10 times a day. Get out of here. His voice was low but carried weight, calibrated to be a threat without being a shout. Now, Sarah didn't stop. We need to get in there. It's an absolute emergency. Trash. The word slipped out with the practiced ease of a daily slur. He looked at Matthew first, then glared at Sarah's swollen belly. His face shifting from cold indifference to sheer disgust, a man who had zero problem wiping the floor with both of them. He doesn't need a brain-dead janitor and a crying, knocked-up waitress contaminating the air. Turn around and use the service exit. Matthew stopped. Not because the insult had landed the way Roger hoped. He stopped because pausing was just part of the processing cycle, like a mainframe temporarily freezing while reallocating all system resources to compute a new firewall bypass. His eyes lifted from the floor for the first and only time in that hallway, and for a split second, he stared at Roger Bates with an expression the security chief couldn't decipher because he had never seen that specific look on a human face before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hurt. It was the look of a man who had just flagged a completely irrelevant variable and instantly calculated a route around it, "Let's go," Matthew said to his sister. He spun on his heel and started walking in the opposite direction. Sarah shot the guard one last venomous look, then followed her brother, hand clutching her stomach, her jaw clenched tight. The basement supply closet was only accessible via a metal staircase that reeked of damp concrete and old grease. It was a windowless, 12-foot square tomb where the hospital tossed everything they didn't want but couldn't legally throw in a dumpster yet boxes of. Expired latex gloves, a rusty gurney with a busted wheel, half-empty jugs of industrial bleach, an old computer battery backup that had been dead long enough to wear a thick coat of grey dust. Sitting on a rusted metal shelf was an enteral feeding pump, the kind used to push nutrients into patients who can't swallow, its digital screen flashing dead zeros, a jagged crack across the plastic casing exposing its green circuit board. The air smelled like stale chlorine, violently mixed with engine grease and something vaguely organic. You really didn't want to investigate. Matthew walked in and immediately went to work. Not frantic, methodical. Moving with the same unnerving precision he used to organize math patterns on the asphalt. But clocked at twice the speed, as if his baseline tempo had been hit with an extreme multiplier without losing a single frame of structure. He cracked open the feeding pump with his bare hands, no tools. Stripping the internal components with an intuitive genius you can't be taught, you're just born with. He yanked the dead battery backup off the shelf, licked his index finger, and tapped the terminals to check the voltage, a casual flex that made Sarah hold her breath, and gave himself a tiny, almost invisible nod. From a cardboard box shoved in the corner, buried under mop heads, he pulled out a bottle of standard 10-volume hydrogen peroxide. He stared at the label, stared at the gutted pump, stared at the wall. The back wall of the closet was infected with a massive bloom of black mold creeping down from a ceiling leak, stretching out in fractal veins right down to eye level. It was a sickly, wet, greyish-green. Matthew walked over to a tin of charcoal the night shift guards used for their weekend tailgate BBQs. It was sitting open in the corner, a few chunks still intact. He grabbed one, and he started writing on the wall. The symbols exploded in horizontal lines at a speed that blatantly mocked the tiny space he had to work with, equations fracturing into sub-equations. Constants trapped in parentheses, chemical vectors pointing out reaction pathways. The Arrhenius equation bled onto the damp mold with the effortless grace of a master's signature, linking the kinetic rate constant, temperature, and activation energy in raw charcoal, turning a toxic basement wall into an Ivy League chalkboard. Sarah stood frozen by the doorframe, one hand gripping the metal jamb, the other resting heavily on her stomach. The baby had kicked twice since they walked down the stairs. She was taking deep breaths, counting the kicks exactly the way she'd been taught in the prenatal class she had financed in 6 credit card installments. The first makeshift beaker bubbled. Then it bubbled faster. Then the liquid inside, which had maintained a promising pale mint green for roughly 40 seconds, violently and decisively darkened, mutating through a swampy brown before hitting pitch black, then bowl visip of the glass, pooling over their makeshift workbench, reeking of a chemical reaction that had desperately wanted to be something else entirely. Matthew froze. The room plunged into dead silence, broken only by the hiss of the black sludge dripping onto the floor and Sarah's jagged breathing. He stared at the equation on the wall. He stared at it for exactly 4 seconds. Sarah counted them without knowing why. Then he raised his bare hand and wiped out a single symbol with his palm, leaving his skin stained pitch black and a glaring white void in the middle of the formula. His hand was shaking. It was the very first time since Sarah had run into him upstairs that any part of her brother's body displayed anything other than absolute machine-like control. He rewrote the symbol in a different spot with a new value. "I'm sorry." His voice was directed into the empty air in front of him. Not specifically at her, but Sarah knew it was meant for her. The alkaline kinetic constant had a standard deviation of 0.03 because of the ambient temperature of the concrete. He glared at the damp wall, at the water seeping through the cracks, at the brutal reality that a sub-basement supply closet was running at least 8 degrees colder than the baseline temperature he had hard-coded into the first equation. I recalibrated. It will work now. Sarah watched her brother, stared at his hunched back over the counter, at those hands working with garbage tools that were never designed to save a life. At the cheap grey uniform he had worn for 3 years in that elite complex without a single one of the 12 silk-embroidered doctors on the top floor ever. Bothering to learn his first name, a tear slipped down her cheek before she could blink it away. "You're not broken." Her voice cracked, low but fierce. "You're the only one who actually sees anything." Matthew didn't reply. But for a fraction of a second, his fingers stopped moving, then they went right back to work. The second beaker didn't turn black. It flashed blue. A brilliant, pulsing cobalt blue that practically glowed under the flickering basement bulb as if it possessed its own internal power source. The exact same impossible blue Sarah had just seen in that calloused hand, gripping a rigged syringe. A flashback making absolute sense where there had only been terror and chaos. Matthew siphoned the liquid into the hollowed-out BIC pen with clinical precision. He hooked up the 4-drip valve he had stashed in his uniform pocket. Sarah didn't bother asking when he swiped it, or if he'd been mapping this out since the hallway, and the entire rig sat in his hands like a tiny, ridiculous piece of plastic that harbored a mathematical cure 12 world-class doctors with $1 million of tech couldn't crack. They climbed the stairs. The ICU corridor held that same suffocating silence. But the frequency had shifted. It wasn't the silence of panic anymore. It was the dead quiet of an impending flatline. Through the IQ window, they could see the bed, the screaming monitors, the doctors wearing faces desperately trying to project focus, but actually just managing the inevitable. His O2 saturation had tanked to 63. Matthew locked his eyes on the double doors and moved. Roger Bates was standing in the exact same spot, like he was glued to the floor. Like that one specific tile was the gravitational center of his miserable existence. He saw them coming, saw the rigged plastic tube in the janitor's hand. He stepped forward, squaring his shoulders. Arms slightly raised, the universal bouncer stance of a man ready to use his own body weight as a concrete wall. Matthew didn't drop his speed by a single mile per hour. Roger lunged, throwing a meat-hook hand toward the grey uniform's shoulder. Sarah threw herself directly into the crossfire. It wasn't a calculated tactical block. It was the blind rage of a 6-month pregnant woman who had violently reached the absolute limit of what she was willing to tolerate from this day, from this hallway, and from this marble palace that had never once treated her like a human being. Touch him. Her voice wasn't a scream. It was the lethal whisper of someone who had completely bypassed fear and landed somewhere psychotic. Touch him, and I will swear under oath you assaulted a pregnant woman. I've got a camera right there, witnesses in the back, and a 6-month bump. The lawsuit will chew through your paycheck until you're begging for change on the turnpike. Roger Bates froze. His raised arms didn't drop, but they didn't advance either. A brutal calculation was running behind those dull eyes, not Matthew's kind of math. No kinetic variables or Arrhenius constants, just the dirty, primal math of a bully weighing the cost of stepping forward against the price of stepping back. Matthew blew past him, didn't flinch, didn't make eye contact, didn't deviate his trajectory by a single millimeter. He hit the ICU double doors with his shoulder and walked right in. The ICU door smashed against the wall with a crack that made every single head in the trauma bay snap up at once. 12 years of Ivy League medical school hadn't prepared a single one of those men and women for the sight. Walking into their sterile room, not because it was terrifying, but because it was a total glitch in reality. A man in a stained grey janitor's uniform, hands smeared with black charcoal, gripping a device that looked like a pipe bomb made out of a high school science fair dumpster, marching straight toward the head of the bed with the absolute calm of a man who owned the building. Richard Sterling was completely cyanotic. The deep purple that had bruised his face had bled all the way down his neck and into his fingertips, his lips a terrifying shade of blue. The Armani suit had been shredded by trauma shears and tossed onto a corner chair like a dirty rag. The monitor above the bed flashed digits the doctors had stopped trying to translate because they defied every pathological model they'd ever memorized. The O to SAT read 58. Matthew didn't look at a single doctor. Didn't look at the glowing screens. Didn't check the intubation tubes. Didn't acknowledge the highly organized chaos of incredibly competent people doing exactly the right things for completely the wrong disease. He walked straight to the headboard like everyone else in the room was a piece of furniture. Dr. Robert Harrison, Chief of Medicine at the Aurelia, two-term President of the National Board of Critical Care, author of 47 peer-reviewed articles, stepped right into his path, throwing an arm up. Hold it. Who the hell are you? What is that? Matthew stopped for the exact millisecond required to log the question. Then, staring right through the Chief of Medicine, his lips began to twitch. The numbers spilled out in a low, rapid-fire stream. Not words. A raw data sequence, digits firing in a progression that made absolutely no logical sense to a normal ear. 48 numbers Matthew recited with the chilling fluency of a man reading a teleprompter only he could see. Dr. Harrison froze. The color physically drained from the doctor's face, washing away like watercolor in the rain. His arm, which had been locked out to shove Matthew back, slowly wilted until it hung completely dead at his side. His voice was barely a rasp. Whispering to himself. That's the genome sequence for the *Schwannella onedensis bacterium. A heavy pause. I've only ever seen that on a whiteboard at MIT. Nobody in the room took a breath. Matthew resumed his pace. He reached the bed. His eyes scanned the central line port for maybe 3 seconds, assessing the gauge. The depth, the flow rate of the useless saline already pushing through the plastic. Then he spliced his rigged, wire-stripped, aquarium-tubed monstrosity straight into the hospital's IV line. The splice was flawless, the exact precision of a master watchmaker, not because Matthew had practiced it, but because the geometry of the flow was as glaringly obvious to him as the geometry of dead leaves in the parking lot. There was exactly one correct angle, everything else was a failure. And finding the right angle just meant opening your eyes. The cobalt blue liquid hit the tube and started feeding down. Sitting against the far wall in a plastic chair was a woman who hadn't engaged in the panic of the last 10 minutes. Brenda was 62 years old, and she had spent 30 of those years inside that exact complex, first as an orderly, then an assistant floor nurse. Surviving 3 architectural remodels, 5 hostile takeovers, and burying countless secrets she kept locked tight because she learned a long time ago that some truths just get you fired, or worse. She stared at Matthew. She stared at him differently than the doctors did. Not with the stunned awe of a medical miracle, not with clinical detachment. She looked at him with the slow, crushing gravity of someone who just dug up a ghost they had personally helped bury. "Oh, dear God," the whisper barely made it past her lips. She was staring at Matthew's hands, at the sharp cut of his jawline, at the slight, telltale tilt of his head to the right whenever his brain was crunching a heavy algorithm. "It's him," the scrub nurse next to her turned. "What? The son?" Brenda couldn't rip her eyes away from Matthew. The son his first wife had. When the kid turned 4 and they realized his brain was wired wrong, she stopped, swallowed hard. Sterling dumped him in a private asylum upstate. Paid a fortune to have his name scrubbed off the birth records. The boy just vanished from the system like he was never born. The silence that hit the room had a completely different density than the panic before it. Sarah, standing in the doorway, right behind her brother, stared at Matthew's back. Stared at those charcoal-stained hands splicing life into a man turning purple on the mattress. At the cheap, grey uniform he had zipped up every single morning for 3 years just to sweep the concrete for a billionaire, who had thrown him away like defective merchandise when he was 4 years old. The brain labeled defective. The son replaced by a redacted file. The little boy who taught himself to read genomic sequences out of garbage cans because the dumpster was the only library in the world without a security guard. And now he was standing there, twisting wires into a central line, becoming the absolute only variable that could balance the equation. The irony was too massive for words, so no one even tried to speak. The blue liquid kept dropping into the vein, onto Gurney glitching itself. The brutal arch of Richard's spine began to drop, not all at once, but in jagged stages, like a snapped steel cable violently uncoiling. His face was still a sickening shade of bruised purple, but the freefall on the monitor hit a hard floor. 58. 59. The doctors stared at the telemetry screen with the shattered expressions of people watching their million-dollar instruments confirm something their textbooks said was impossible. Richard's eyes fluttered open. Not fully. Not with a clear mind. But just enough to focus on the face hovering above him, the face that wasn't looking back. The face that was entirely locked onto the plastic rig and the telemetry digits with that blinding, autistic focus that left zero bandwidth for human empathy. And then, dragging himself up from the absolute bottom of a nightmare, a spark of pure recognition flashed across the dying man's eyes. Matthew spoke. Not to the chief of medicine. Not to Zara. To the man, gasping on the table, using his standard, flat, robotic monotone. Devoid of vengeance and completely empty of forgiveness, delivering data exactly as it was meant to be received. You are going to sign the transfer of shares. The IV tube was still pinched between his fingers. The cobalt liquid was still flowing. But there was a final reservoir chamber inside the BIC pen, the absolute last dose that would either balance the chemical equation or leave it permanently, fatally unresolved. Not to me, to the pension fund of the janitorial staff. And to the low-income maternity clinic you demolished last year. Richard tried to talk. His throat just pushed out a wet, garbage sound. Sign it. Matthew locked eyes with him for the very first time. Dead center pupil to pupil, for the first and only time that afternoon, and maybe for the first and only time in 30 years. Or I let the alpha decay constant finish the job. There was no malice in his voice. There was only math. And Richard Sterling III, who had spent for decades building an empire by terrorizing people who couldn't decipher his financial equations, was finally pinned against the wall by an equation he couldn't buy his way out of. Pinned down by a calculation run by a smarter man using dumpster scraps in a basement reeking of bleach and motor oil. Pinned down by the son he threw in the garbage for being different. The solid gold Mont Blanc pen was placed between his shaking fingers. And for the second time that afternoon, Richard Sterling held a pen without having a single choice that actually mattered. It's hard to believe a man could spend his entire life destroying what he can't comprehend, right? If you agree that the brilliance ignored by arrogant people deserves a standing ovation, smash that like button right now to prove you're standing with Matthew. Now let me ask you, if you were Matthew, after everything that monster put you through, after the asylum, after having your name erased, after years in a grey uniform sweeping your own father's asphalt, would you have saved his life? Or would you have stood there and let the math sort itself out? Tell me in the comments. I want to know exactly what you would do. This story proves that the person the world writes off as worthless might be the exact person the world needs to survive, and that genius doesn't ask for permission to exist. Even when someone spends their entire life trying to scrub your name out of existence. If you love stories that hit hard and make you think, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss out. You're a part of our family now. The hand that signed the digital contract was no longer the hand of a man who bought yachts on a whim. It was a hand that violently shook, sweaty, still bruised purple from the neurotoxin, carrying the phantom muscle memory of being 60 seconds away from flatlining into a morgue cooler. The iPad had been rushed up by a junior corporate lawyer, terrified kid who clearly hadn't been briefed on the crossfire he just walked into, wearing a painfully neutral face while aggressively trying to ignore the chaos around him. Richard Sterling stared down at the screen. 51%. The exact block of voting shares that held absolute control over the complex, the satellite surgical centers, and the hedge funds built on for decades of ruthless, unquestioned power. The transfer was typed up in bulletproof Airtight legalese, Matthew had rattled off the exact clauses to Sarah, who had dictated them over the phone to the lawyer like she was reading off a teleprompter, even though she was just reciting her brother's raw data. The pension fund for the janitorial staff, maintenance crews, and hourly workers, the ghosts who haunted the same building as the silk-scrubbed surgeons, but existed in an entirely different dimension, a dimension of service elevators, concrete backstairs, and closets smelling of bleach. The low-income maternity clinic that had been bulldozed 8 months ago because the quarterly profit margin didn't justify the real estate, the margin of a man who had never set foot in a public clinic, who was born in a VIP hospital suite with chilled champagne on the nightstand. Richard stared at the tablet, then up at the ceiling tiles, then back down at his own shaking hands. The stylus hit the glass. Every single letter of his own signature dragged out slow, jagged, completely stripped of the arrogant flourish of a man used to signing billion-dollar buyouts blind. They were the letters of a man whose brain finally understood, with every pathetic twitch of his wrist, exactly what he was signing away. Not just the stock, not just the board seat, but the entire godlike version of himself that had existed up until that very afternoon. The man who never had to answer to anyone. That man was bleeding to death right there on a digital screen, letter by letter, held by a junior lawyer who was currently fighting for his life to keep a straight face. When he finished the last loop, he didn't say a word. Nobody said a word. The silence carried the brutal, crushing weight of something utterly permanent. To truly understand the fallout, we need to jump forward 3 months. Spring hit the medical campus with the exact same cold indifference that seasons have for glass and steel buildings. The trees in the lot turned a rich green, the new leaves replacing the dead ones Matthew used to map out in Fibonacci sequences on the concrete. The white Calcutta marble inside still mirrored the Swarovski chandeliers. The AC still pumped that signature bergamot and oud perfume on a timer that hadn't been interrupted for a single second by the hostile takeover of the executive floors. Richard walked into the main lobby with the stiff, hyper-aware stride of an exiled king trying to figure out how to stand in a castle he used to own. He was technically a board member now. The title looked decent in print, maybe even sounded intimidating at a cocktail party, but anyone plugged into the matrix knew exactly what it meant. He was on a leash. There were auditors specifically hired to flag his decisions before he even made them, and legal tripwires rigged to turn his every move into a hostile negotiation where he held exactly zero leverage. He walked down the 12th floor corridor, the glass conference room that used to host the executive, board the exact same room where 12 custom-tailored doctors had smirked at his joke about parasites, and service doors had been entirely gutted. The imported oak chairs were shoved carelessly against the wall. Dead center, an arched rig of 3 massive monitors dominated the desk, and sitting in front of them was a man wearing a cheap, completely blank white lab coat. No embroidered name, no silk hospital logo, absolutely none of the status markers that room was built to worship. Matthew wasn't looking at the glowing screens. He was staring at a blank patch of air slightly to the left, processing an invisible data stream before his fingers could punch in the next string of code. His lips twitched in their usual silent rhythm. His hands floated over the keyboard without an ounce of rush. The room was actively solving, in real time, the massive supply chain hemorrhage bleeding the entire hospital dry, locating pharmaceutical distribution leaks and predicting supply crunches that a decade of Ivy League MBAs never caught. Because standard MBAs didn't read bacterial genome sequences out of trash cans or map mathematical fractals on a parking lot grid. The budget surplus generated in his first 60 days alone was enough to fully fund the rebuilt maternity clinic for an entire fiscal year. Richard stopped dead in the hallway, stared through the glass. Matthew didn't look back. It wasn't because he didn't notice him. Matthew constantly tracked variables that normal people were physically blind to. He had absolutely logged the presence, the exact coordinate position, and the duration of his father's pause in the hallway. But he had processed the data packet and arrived at his usual baseline conclusion, completely irrelevant variable for the current algorithm. The indifference wasn't an act. It wasn't spite. It was just the factory setting of a man who had decided, a long time ago, without a shred of drama, that some numbers simply do not factor into the math. For a tyrant who had built his entire identity on forcing people to feel the crushing weight of his presence, who manipulated the air in a room with terror or charm as he saw fit, there was no hell worse than this. It wasn't anger. It wasn't a grudge. It was the absolute, total absence of relevance. Richard kept walking. The recovery room in the rebuilt maternity ward had soft sand-colored walls and a massive window that flooded the floor with unfiltered late afternoon sun. There were no crystal chandeliers, no imported Italian marble on the floor, just warm oak. A rocking chair by the glass and the microscopic sound of something brand new breathing with the rapid, fragile rhythm of a human who just got here and hasn't learned the world is ugly yet. Sarah was propped up in bed with Michael resting on her chest. Not the hypothetical Michael from a few months ago, the one who kicked her ribs in the basement while his biological father choked to death on a gurney upstairs. This was the real, physical Michael now, exactly 3 days old, his tiny fists curled tight against his cheeks. Wearing that intense, frowning focus newborns have when they sleep, as if dreaming is a full-time job. The door opened without a sound. Matthew walked in, wearing normal clothes, now not the janitor's grey. Just a plain shirt. He didn't smile. It wasn't that he was physically incapable of it, it was just that smiling, for him, was a specific social protocol that required a prompt. And the raw emotion hitting his chest in that room didn't translate into simple facial geometry. He stood near the edge of the mattress for a beat. Then he held out a thick manila envelope. Sarah looked up at him. Looked at the envelope. Gently shifted Michael into the crook of her left arm and popped the seal with her free hand, careful not to tear the paper. Inside was a single piece of paper. A fully funded trust account ledger. The bottom line was printed in a blunt, microscopic font. 0 aesthetic formatting, the exact total. Calculated with the savage precision that only Matthew operated on. Covering the comprehensive tuition for an Ivy League medical degree. Perfectly adjusted for inflation for the exact year Michael would be old enough to enroll. Sarah stared up at her brother. Matthew was staring down at Michael. Locked in with that hyperfixated focus he reserved for dead leaves, chemical equations, and genome sequences, the gaze of a man reading a blueprint the rest of the world couldn't even see. He has unusually long fingers, Matthew said, flat, factual, statistically advantageous for a surgical rotation. Sarah laughed. It was a heavy, broken laugh that dragged itself up from the bottom of her soul. Cutting through the bone-deep exhaustion, the overwhelming love, and the traumatic 3 months since she walked down that marble hallway. It came out tangled with hot tears because sometimes the human body just can't compartmentalize the files properly. Matthew didn't laugh, but he didn't leave. And that was enough. It always had been. Now I'm asking you, what do you think destroys an arrogant billionaire's ego more, losing his fortune? Or being forced to admit his life was saved by the exact person he treated like garbage? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your take. Dusk rolled over the asphalt parking lot with the slow, golden crawl of a sunset doing exactly what it's supposed to do. The oak trees threw long, sharp shadows across the blacktop, and the massive glass complex looming behind it hummed with the harsh white fluorescent glare of a building that refuses to shut down. Matthew walked through the empty lot, hands hanging straight at his sides. A dry leaf drifted down. Not from the lot's trees, caught in an updraft from miles away. A dead leaf that had traveled all this way for reasons that didn't fit into any algorithm he had memorized, or maybe belonged to an equation he just hadn't written yet. He caught it out of the air, held it right in front of his eyes. He scanned the microscopic veins with the laser focus of a cartographer, the primary arteries, the secondary offshoots, the fractal distribution grids nature had beta tested over millions. of years to push water and nutrients from a dead center core out to the very edges with absolute maximum efficiency. The leaf was an equation, because everything was. He dropped his eyes to the pavement. The toe of his shoe dragged slowly across the clean black asphalt, tracing out lines that only formed a complete image when you zoomed out and when the full grid was rendered. There was a mathematical formula etched into the dust with the effortless ease of someone scribbling their own name. On the left side, the primary variable. On the right, the quotient of a fraction multiplied by a unit of time. Humility equals knowledge divided by pride, multiplied by time. Matthew stared down at the formula for a long, silent second. Then he let the dead leaf slip from his fingers, drifting down to land dead center in the middle of the equation, where it settled with the gentle weight of something that had finally found exactly where it belonged. This story proves that a person's true value is never determined by the price tag the world slaps on them. It's built on what they carry inside when absolutely no one is watching. That genius, no matter how deeply buried, doesn't just fade away. It calculates, it grows, and it detonates at the exact moment the world least expects it. If you crave stories that hit you right in the chest and force you to look at the world differently, smash subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss out on our rawest emotional deep dives. You are part of this family.